Good afternoon. My presentation focuses on megalomania as a psychosocial disease. As Dr. Chandra has shown, megalomania is characterized by a narcissistic, self-aggrandizing, and power-seeking psychology and conduct. I want to explore these attributes of megalomania in terms of their manifestations in the political domain. Typically, such an examination focuses on individual leaders whose character, discourse, and behavior represent an exaggerated sense of self-worth, a belief in their inherent right to dominate, denial of any responsibility for their destructive impact on others, and the conviction that they function as savior to the people whose interests they claim to represent. An apt illustration is the recent proclamation by former President Trump to an adoring crowd in Waco, Texas, where he said, "In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. And now I say to you tonight, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, of which there are many, I am your retribution." While this kind of narcissistic leadership is worthy of analysis, I want to shift our focus to consider the following question. Why does such a self-aggrandizing assertion by a politician find resonance among so many citizens in this country? It's important to consider that while megalomania represents a potential in all human beings, it can be exacerbated or contained by specific cultures, social structures, ideologies, and political movements, as well as formative personal relationships. In the words of Lacanian philosopher Louis Althusser, we are interpolated, by which he meant we're hailed as social subjects through hegemonic ideology that permeates and is reproduced by the family, the church, the media, the educational system, political parties, and so-called experts who hold the key and convey the rules of how to embody one's cultural ideals and expectations. Keeping in mind the concept of interpolation, I want to extend two of Dr. Chandra's categories of megalomania: gaining power through privilege and gaining power through abuse, to consider megalomania as a psychosocial disease in this country. I'm going to argue that our history and culture have encouraged a receptivity among many to identify with and enact megalomaniac resolutions to intrapsychic and interpersonal conflict. A brief account of this process sheds light on how and why such patterns are becoming prominent among more citizens in today's fractured society. To what extent might we consider megalomania as a normative characteristic of this country's cultural matrix? Like other settler colonial nations, the US was founded on racialized capitalism, in which Europeans appropriated by force the land and resource of indigenous peoples and the minds and bodies of African enslaved men, women, and children. By the 17th century, new racial categories of white deemed inherently superior and Black judged inherently inferior were invented to justify the Euro-American exploitation of people of color. This racial ideology reinforced already established European practices in which power was secured by those most avariciously determined to dominate others within existing hierarchical relationships based on class, culture, and gender. Over the past 400 years, Euro-American traditions have been privileged, while the cultures of colonized peoples demeaned, constituting a social world that decolonial scholars called the coloniality of power. How have these stratified power relations been maintained throughout our history? By force, when people cooperate to demand equitable alternatives to a system that abuses the rights of the majority. But more generally, power has been achieved through consensus, in which each generation has internalized the dominant ideological precepts and culturally syntonic psychological predispositions that facilitate success within the system. These include designing one's life based on self-interest, a competitive spirit, a willingness to exploit others, and a disavowal of interpersonal responsibility and empathy. Notions of rugged individualism and social Darwinism, with which people of all social classes have identified, rationalize social inequities as natural outgrowths of inherent differences related, for example, to race and gender. What has been the role of the state in the preservation of inequities? With periodic exceptions like the New Deal that sought a more just distribution of wealth and opportunity, generally, government has functioned to protect the interests of elites at the expense of the majority. For example, by the 1970s, the New Deal welfare state was replaced by an economic model and governance strategy known as neoliberalism. Its goal was to reconcentrate wealth and power in the hands of financial elites. The neoliberal politics of austerity have represented a return to the most exploitative versions of capitalism, including the dismantling of public institutions and the shift of responsibility from the state to the individual citizen for survivability. Neoliberal ideology interpolates citizens to live lives based on entrepreneurial values and goals. These include notions of personal accountability for success or failure, without consideration of structural obstacles such as class, race, gender, education, rates of unemployment, and limited social welfare benefits. This ideological technique of power has obfuscated the destabilizing impact of neoliberalism over the last 4 decades. Indeed, the grandiose endeavors of political and economic elites have dramatically concentrated wealth and authority and intensified the rate of exploitation of the economically and politically disenfranchised. The latter, having internalized neoliberal ideology, tend to identify with assumptions that each individual is responsible for achieving the good life, measured in terms of a decent income, home ownership, upward mobility, and unconstrained access to consumption of desired commodities. Neoliberalism reinforces the cultural fiction that only one's personal inadequacies can prevent the realization of these indices of success. This constitutes a relationship to hegemony that cultural theorist Lauren Berland calls cruel optimism. Cruel because it impedes the possibility of developing a critical awareness of the systemic impediments to their achievement, and cruel because of the affective expressions of this ideology that encourage narcissistic and competitive strivings that risk exploiting others and undermining capacities of empathy and connection to community. What makes the current crisis in our political life so difficult to negotiate through cooperative and empathic reformist strategies? In addition to forceful repression by the state and corporate elites, the answer lies in citizens' identifications with neoliberal ideology. It encourages aspirations for autonomy, self-reliance, and competitiveness that produce a complementary denial of reliance on others and needs for social relations of reciprocity. The internalization of these attitudes and values produces what psychoanalyst Lynn Layton calls a normative unconscious, which fosters a narcissistic character through the over-evaluation of agentic capacities and the denigration of attachment needs. Such a bifurcation of human capacities requires that those who occupy privileged positions in a variety of social hierarchies project dependency and need onto the less powerful, where it can be scorned. And the less powerful are vulnerable to states of shame, the quintessential emotion associated with the inability to embody the cultural ideal of autonomy and self-sufficiency. Failure is experienced as proof of personal inadequacy rather than social catastrophe. How do those who are deeply abjected within and by class hierarchies respond? Increasingly, through recourse to grandiose states of mind by which they can defend themselves against fragility and instability. Many experience humiliation as well as helpless rage in response to the negative impact on their lives of potent social forces difficult to perceive and understand. They are vulnerable to the authoritarianism of the political right that has mobilized a multi-class alliance from the super wealthy to those who have lost their access to prosperity and the self-esteem it accords. The political right has mobilized these individuals through white supremacist ideology, encouraging abusive assaults against the most vulnerable in our society, including people of color, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, women, and LGBTQ individuals. The potential for empathy among middle and working class whites has been eroded by the political activation of their aggression. Fantasies that the strategic moment has arrived to reassert the lost era of white rule lend a sense of power to the powerless. Through racial superiority, they will have access to the privilege upon which the political and economic elites have maintained power. How might we account for this psychosocial phenomenon? As originally noted by psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi, identification with the aggressor is a typical response to pervasive conditions of social and psychological insecurity. Gender theorist Jack Halberstam explicates how shame, and I quote, records in dramatic fashion a failure to be powerful, legitimate, proper. It records the exposure in psychoanalytic terms of the subject's castration, be it racial, gendered, class-based, or sexual, close quote. Relief from shame can be achieved through unconscious processes of displacement and projection in which hatred of self is turned outward toward culturally denigrated others. So I've argued that megalomania as a social disease can be understood in light of how social forces, ideology, and unconscious processes interact over time to exacerbate rather than inhibit the human potential to experience and enact self-serving and merciless strivings for power. What has been the response within psychoanalysis to our increasingly problematic social world? A reconceptualization of the causes of psychopathology has occurred, moving away from the customarily exclusive focus on familial ideology to a more expansive consideration of how subjectivity and relational patterns are products of a broader social interpolation. More recently, partially in response to the Black Lives Matter movement More psychoanalysts are critically aware of the deeply embedded racism in our culture and the responsibility we have to attend to its inevitable manifestations in the transference-countertransference relationship. As well, a decolonial turn has arisen to shed light on how coloniality simultaneously constructs human subjects and less than human objects, producing a schism within humanity that encourages attitudes and behaviors lacking in empathy and reciprocity. More effort is made to examine the ways in which psychoanalysis has uncritically reflected and reproduced Eurocentric definitions of mental health, in the process reinforcing the alienation at the base of neoliberal identity formation and interpersonal experience. Critical explorations into Eurocentric biases that disparage cultures of non-Euro-American peoples has led to insights about the unconscious proclivity among too many analysts to equate mental health with white Eurocentric values. This psychoanalytic sensibility is identified with the perspective of those whom Caribbean decolonial psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, by which he meant those most vulnerable to the system's oppressive impact. Expanding on Fanon, a decolonial psychoanalysis is attentive to the multiple wounds of the modern colonial world and the psychoaffective suffering of the oppressed. It offers a critique of how treatment has historically been limited to consideration of patients' desires for self-actualization, exclusively within the limited domains of love and work, rather than facilitating capacities to understand ourselves as the product of our social location and a society based on exploitative relationships, in which megalomaniac resolutions of conflict are normative. Thus, it critiques how psychoanalysis has unconsciously functioned to shore up character traits capable of achieving power within this system, rather than probe our roles as implicated subjects who function as cogs in the wheel of unjust social relations. A clinical decolonial psychoanalysis is emerging that encourages a transformational process in which both analyst and patient critically explore our unconscious and ideological enactments of individualism and competitiveness that undermine capacities for empathy and concern for the welfare of others. The stakes could not be higher. We face global elites whose economic power, political control, ideological influence, and psychological predilections impose unbearable economic duress for the world's majorities. Their addiction to militaristic confrontations potentiates nuclear conflagration. Their compulsive profit-making has produced an environmental crisis that threatens all life on Earth. It could not be a better moment for us to examine the phenomenon of megalomania so as to combat its destructive impact on us all.